It's given me a lot of pleasure once more to call upon a member of ours to give this afternoon's talk. He's not just a member, he's a very important member. He's the Secretary of the Executive Committee. He's a convener of 3 interest groups, and he's given some very interesting talks over the years. We've always enjoyed the presentation made by Andrew. So will you put your hands together now to welcome Andrew Collier.
Thank you very much, Handel. Are you hearing me? Yes? Yes. And thank you all for coming. Are you still hearing me?
No. Can you speak?
Are you hearing me now?
Yes.
Are you still hearing me now?
Yes.
Right. Because all the technicalities, the only thing is I haven't been to makeup, I'm sorry. Basically, this talk started because years ago I tried to teach the First World War to lots of schoolboys. And I saw that there was an anniversary coming up. And it started life as a school course, and I sort of thought, well, I could put the pictures on that now with this wonderful technology that we have, and do that as a talk. What I hadn't anticipated and should have done was that you were going to get a welter of First World War stuff on telly. Some of it has been extremely good, I think. So I'm probably drilling you through it all again. But anyway, in the course of that coming up, 1 or 2 questions have come up, which I think it's worth pondering. It's become very controversial. Was it the unnecessary war? In some ways, the way I taught it was that this was the war that you couldn't explain. Why did we go to... What was it all about? The Second World War was fairly clearly against something evil. The First World War, why? And different historians have now come down on different sides, and we've got Ferguson saying, yes, we were right to go to war, and other people. Basically, anyway, I hope we will answer 1 or 2 of those as we go along. The other thing that I think has changed, my original title was First World War 100 Years On. I think that 100 years does make it very hard to understand. For youngsters today, it is clearly 100 years gap. For us, it's 40 or 50 years gap. And our grandparents, all of us here, knew people who were deeply involved, whose lives were affected by it in a big way. And the perspectives have changed. The perspectives have changed in a whole lot of them. Let's just mention 2. Class, the class system. I think the evidence has to be that we are less riddled by class than they were then. And the place of women. I'm good in history. I wonder occasionally if I'm going to be taken to court because some email I sent or some remark I make in history is going to be quoted against me in public. And I shall lose. I haven't got a job, it's all right, I'm retired. But this guy in the football. So basically, the perspectives in these areas have changed enormously. Amongst the things that people don't fully always understand is this one. Basically, it is hard now to understand that there was no such country as Germany until 1870. Germany was a new country. The land existed, but it was lots of different princedoms and dukedoms and scattered all over the place. It has only been a country, by the times that we're talking about, for 40-odd years. And it was born with all the difficulties that all the other big countries have already got empires. And that is one of the issues which it is hard for us, with hindsight, and hard for us as being the great imperial power that we still know we were, to understand. Anyway, that is in the Palace of Versailles, and that is the declaration of the arrival of Germany. The guy with the tash at the top of the stairs is the new Kaiser, Wilhelm I. The guy in the white jacket at the bottom of the stairs is Bismarck, who's arranged it all and brought Germany, all these different states, after 3 wars. He's brought 3 states together, 3 wars against Denmark, against Austria, and now against France. And he is in the Palace of Versailles, a conqueror of France, declaring the German Empire. France didn't like it. The French hated the Germans for the next generation, for the next 100 years. One of the achievements of the EU is that those 2 countries stopped hating each other and started to work together. But at the time that we're talking about, there is huge antipathy between them. Alsace and Lorraine, 2 major states in France, containing Strasbourg and other, belonged to Germany from 1870, right through to the end of the war that we're talking about. So France is very suspicious. Everything about French consciousness is anti-German. If you want to think about that, think about the Dreyfus case. What did Dreyfus not do? He did not sell secrets to the Germans, but that's what he's accused of. That's what it's all about. The French are in big suspicion. And the other little picture is Bismarck. When that Kaiser died, his son, who was married to Queen Victoria's oldest daughter, was dying of cancer. He lasted 6 months, and then in comes the nutcase Kaiser, Wilhelm II, the one that when we talk about the Kaiser in this country, we're talking about Wilhelm II. And he rapidly got rid of Bismarck and started what in the end is one of the things that is pretty much got a huge responsibility for the war and the disasters that we're going to be talking about. Wilhelm II took charge and took very much personal charge. One of the ironies is that it was a parliamentary democracy that he took over. Another of the ironies was that there was a socialist government in charge. It was actually, Germany was in some ways ahead of us in terms of welfare state and pensions and things. But we have this autocratic Kaiser who is being dominated, by the time we are really interested, being dominated by the military. Cause number 2, well, the Kaiser was jealous of Granny. He was jealous of Granny's, Queen Victoria, jealous of Granny's navy, jealous of Granny's empire. And late in the day, when Africa, for instance, has been nearly all carved up, Germany tries to join in and grab a few colonies. And the tensions that arise from that are one of the causes of the war. The picture on the left is John Bull walking off with France in an extraordinary turnaround, the Entente Cordiale. The importance of the Entente Cordiale is that it ends, at least in theory, it ends something that has been part of every Brit's consciousness and psychology for the previous 500 years. Who's the old enemy? The frogs. And it ain't the frogs anymore. You've got to learn to love the frogs. At the time of the Franco-Prussian War, there were people who were... The school where I taught, which was an evangelical Church of England school, they had a sermon, it's in the annals of it, there's a sermon favouring the Prussians in the Franco-Prussian War because they're the ones with the prayer books as opposed to the incense. So there is this rivalry, and the rivalry takes its biggest form in the building of dreadnoughts and battleships and the naval rivalry. The Kaiser used to come to the Spithead Review, go to Cowes, liked showing off. And this is our third one. One of the things I'm going to try and do is to look at this story from the perspective of other countries. Austria-Hungary is a ramshackle empire. It's been cobbled together by the marrying of its royal family, the Habsburgs, have married each other until they have the biggest empire right across the centre of Europe. Initially, of course, the Habsburgs are the kings of Spain. Go back to all that. But anyway, by this time, they rule not just Austria, not just Hungary, everything that we've called Yugoslavia and now call all those different parts. Bulgaria and Romania is either theirs or it belongs to the third one on the list. Russia is struggling under a Tsar and a very old-fashioned system, as now, by the time of the First World War, has been beaten by Japan, is shown how it's cracking at the seams, falling apart at the seams, but held together by an autocratic monarch. Turkey has been the sick man of Europe for 50, if not 100 years. It owns all of that, all of the Balkans, or initially. Its weakness has been fed upon by both Russia and the Austrian Empire. It is losing control. And then you chuck in new Balkan states. We'll refer to them as we go along. One of the other factors is that after the Kaiser had ditched Bismarck, Bismarck had got it nicely arranged that the three Kaisers, that's Austria has an emperor, Russia has a Tsar, another word for emperor, and the Prussians, now Germany, have a Kaiser. They had something called the Dry Kaiserbund, the three Kaisers, the three emperors' union. It fell apart when Bismarck was ditched. That meant that Germany became vulnerable, Russia was unhappy, and in the end, by the turn of the century, you've got us making an entente cordiale, which I thought I got a picture of, but I apparently haven't. I've shown a picture of that already. You've got Russia becoming an ally of France. Oh, I have. Up top left is the entente cordiale picture. Russia and France are becoming allies. You want the proof of it? That's the Alexander Bridge in Paris. Many of you have walked across it at one time or another. And then on the other side, these are the only two Kaisers left. And they, in the middle of it all, are isolated. But half the treaties, half the agreements between them are signed, secret, and nobody, not the parliaments of the countries themselves, know all the terms and conditions attached to them. Right, we're off. We're going to war. The Sarajevo incident. Top left, Princip being arrested, having shot the Archduke. Princip, a Serb. Serbia, an independent country for the last 40, 50 years, but used to be Austrian. Thing is, Bosnia, next door, still belongs to Austria, also wants its independence, and this is what it's about. And then Austria declares war on Serbia. The Russians have treaties with Serbia. So Austria was encouraged to declare that war. Some of you have seen programs, a brilliant play on telly where you have the interplay of these things. The Germans encouraging the Austrians to do it. Austria is now at war with Serbia. Russia joins in to defend Serbia. We have this chain reaction. If Russia is at war with Austria, who's sworn to defend Austria? Germany. If Germany is at war and anybody's at war with Russia, then France is the one that is not completely committed, is us. But we join in. The probability is we would have joined in anyway, but we did join in because the Kaiser, Germany, moved in on Belgium. Now, Belgium, too, is a new-ish country. Belgium was actually created in 1830. They hired themselves a king who was Queen Victoria's uncle. That's the first of the Leopolds. Leopold has actually been an embarrassment. It's her mother's brother, an embarrassment around the English court. He becomes the new king of a newly independent Belgium. In 1839, everybody promised that Belgium would remain neutral, and in return for remaining neutral, everybody would defend it. They signed the scrap of paper. Right. Oh, this is the bit where I wanted to try and move around. Well, we've gone into war confident. On the whole, the people were behind it. This is the thing that is hardest to understand. It becomes almost impossible to understand by the time you reach the end of 1915. Why were we doing it? But we went to war believing we were going to win by Christmas. The women are encouraging the men to go and get their bit of glory. The whole attitude to war is one of the things that we can hardly get to grips with today, looking back. France. France is going to war because it hates the Germans. Russia is going to war because it's got to prove itself. One of the downsides for the Russians is that some of those poor Russian peasants are going to be sent off to see affluence and living conditions they've never seen before. But Russia is going to war in defense of Serbia and all those things, but it has some humiliating times in the last. They lost the Japanese, as I said. They've got something to prove. Belgium is a very interesting. I'll come back to Belgium in a minute. Next one there is Serbia, because Serbia is under attack. Bottom one on that little list is Japan. Japan is just entering the modern world. It's entering the modern world, as we've been doing in history recently. It's entering the modern world at the point of a gun. The Americans, then all the other imperial powers, the British, the French, the Germans, are forcing them to open up. And what they can do is they're going to control the Pacific end for us, and we're going to give them a free hand. So as far as they're concerned, this is a chance to prove themselves and gain all around the place. Italy doesn't join in at first. Italy, in fact, nominally, one of these secret treaties, is engaged to join the other side. It's going to join in with the Germans and Austrians. It doesn't, and eventually joins in 1915 when they think there's a bit of land up for grabs. Then you've got Romania, and then towards the end we'll bring in the United States. Down the other side, that's the old German flag. That's the Austria-Hungary, a dual monarchy. The emperor is the king of Hungary, and the emperor of Austria, so you've got the two crowns and so on. And that is Turkey, which is going to join in soon, and Bulgaria. Well, the Bulgarians have been independent for 30, 40 years. 1878, they got a little bit, then they became a bit more independent, then they got involved in various so-called Balkan wars, and, well, they're going to be bribed one way or the other. We tried to persuade them. The Germans did better in terms of persuading them, and we come to that. Right. I said that already, really. We didn't want to go to war, but by jingo if we do, we've got the men, we've got the ships, we've got the money too. And that's been the attitude for some little while. So here we go. The propaganda. The more you look at this, we blame Goebbels for inventing propaganda. Rubbish. We are so good at it. The people who went to war in 1914 thought they were going for some brilliant cause. They're fighting for freedom again and again. And what's it about? Well, women of Britain say go. I don't think they'd have said it if they'd known what they were sending them to. On the right, anti-German feeling becomes so strong that George V has to sweep out all the old. He's a member of the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. But he's now about to invent a new title, the Windsors. So he becomes the first of the line of the Windsors. And down there, little doggies like that had a rough time in 1915 because they're called Dachshunds. Right, German plan. Oh, I used to explain this at length. Basically, the Germans have known and been planning this for a long time. Schlieffen is now a man of the past. He's the man who followed the first Moltke, and the first Moltke is the man who helped to beat the French in 1870. So we've now got onto the second Moltke. Top left is the Kaiser, Moltke on the right. I think it may be Schlieffen on the left, I'm not sure. Anyway, the German plan is to beat France in the first few months, if not the first few weeks of the war. And to do so, this is the reason that they went through Belgium. To go south of Belgium is to go through the forest of the Ardennes. To go south of that is to go through the area where the French have fortified most strongly. Verdun and round there. So that's heavily fortified. Go any further down and you're into the Alps. So the best route for charging at Paris, capturing Paris, beating the French in the first few weeks is through Belgium. So through we go. Our army, it was called by the German Prime Minister Bethmann a contemptible little army. I think the Kaiser is off. Anyway, contemptible, no. But little, by their standards, little it was. Our army, traditionally, we're an island nation, our army is a third or a quarter of the size of most of the other big powers. We depend on our navy. We sent it across, and it was not ineffective. It has, sometimes thought, but basically, we have an honourable retreat at the Mons. These are the British Expeditionary Force lining up for before the Battle of Mons, I think. Top left, there are two things. On the left is a man called Haldane, who has, under the Asquith government, reformed the army, because we didn't do particularly well in the Boer War. The Boer War showed us up as being out of date, and Haldane hasn't taken steps to at least modernise the army. Then the next one across is General French and the Prime Minister Asquith. In my list of Prime Ministers a while back, I give you Asquith as one of the great reforming governments. But I can't give you Asquith as one of the great war Prime Ministers. He was totally unsuited to it. And we come back to that very briefly later. In front of Asquith is General French, Sir John French. John French is in charge of the British Expeditionary Force. I promised somebody here I'd tell them a bit more about Sir John French. Sir John French didn't enjoy India very much, and Sir John French also got into trouble in India. Sir John French had an attachment to one of his officers' wives, which very nearly ended the career of Sir John French. So Sir John French then took leave, which came to be known as French leave. So there's something for you to drop into a conversation sometime, taking French. So Sir John, if he'd taken a month's more leave than he did take, it was like a sabbatical to recover his reputation and get away from the scandal. And if he'd taken a month more, he would have ended his military career. Anyway, he didn't. He was then involved in the Sudan, and he's then involved in the Boer War. So he's built up a career, despite the French leave. But the French leave bit, the bit with somebody else's wife, is very out of tune with the British Army, particularly out of tune with Kitchener, who's a very respectable, old-fashioned sort of guy, and hardly fits with Hay. Anyway, there we go. Those are the first battles of the war. Mons was a retreat, but we did slow them down. And that slowing them down means the failure of the Schlieffen plan. The Battle of the Marne, a bit lower down on the river, is where we actually drive them back a little bit. And having brought things to a halt, we then have this thing, the drive to the sea. And so we're now into the late autumn of 1914. We've reached the beginning of a long drawn-out stalemate. And what do? We dig in. We dig our trenches. And where do we dig our trenches? Well, we then have to go a little bit north to stop them from going around the top. And they have to go a little bit south to stop them going around the bottom. And they're doing the same. And by the time you reach the winter of 1915, there is the line of trenches which you see there, all the way from the Channel down to Switzerland. So actually, that doesn't take you all the way down. Anyway, all the way down to Switzerland, this endless line of trenches with no man's land down the middle, sometimes 100 yards apart, sometimes a mile or two apart. But that is the development. And along with that development, it is a stalemate. I said we'd talk about Belgium, because this is a little bit of a story which changes the complexion of it in several ways. If you were Belgian thinking about the First World War, you'd not be talking about the slaughter in the Somme. You'd be thinking about the fact that for 4 years, nearly 5 years, your country was occupied by the enemy. Your king actually put up a fight, part of the Battle of the Mons, and then the Yser, which was mentioned on that last list. In the end, they were crushed. He held on to a tiny pocket of land which remained sort of independent throughout that time, but the bulk of Belgium was occupied. So you would be looking back on a completely different war. The emphasis would be not, oh, Grandpa fought in the trenches. Oh, our country was occupied by the enemy. And enemy it was. And this is one of the bits that when we're talking about what it's about, the way that the Germans treated the Belgians is hardly to anybody's credit. When you hear Kerry's talk, you will hear about Porthcawl helping Belgian refugees. We were big on that. Can't see Kerry at the moment, anyway, the talk's coming. So that one is a big one. Albert remains, this is the king at the time, young man there, died in a skiing accident or a mountaineering accident in the 30s, but a sort of a European hero. Brave little Belgium, the rape of Belgium, remember Belgium, all about the scrap of paper. But it's a different perspective and a different emphasis. The other thing that I learned literally in doing this is a man called Herbert Hoover, who was an American businessman based in Europe. His first job when the war broke out was to help American businessmen and other people to get home. His second job, which became one of his great expertises in life, was to keep the population of Belgium fed for the next 5 years. When you hear about Marshall plans and things like that, Hoover set up a fund which kept the Belgians fed because they're occupied. Several thousand of them in the end are executed and die. But thousands, millions, the Belgian population as a whole came to depend on this fund set up by Herbert Hoover, future President of the United States, at this stage a businessman, not even a politician, goes into politics from here. After the war, he spent the same amount of time. I'd always seen Hoover as being the man who was replaced by Roosevelt as being a not very successful president. But some of his achievements, because after the war, he is responsible for keeping the German population alive and helping white Russians as well. So in terms of food, feeding populations who are destitute, it's a new move, it's something you haven't heard of before, and it's an American achievement, and it's pioneered by this man Hoover. We were in command of the seas. In the autumn of 1914, a few things happened. You've got a Battle of Coronel, a Battle of the Falklands, and the naughty, nasty, horrible Germans raided Scarborough, Whitby and Hartlepool. And it was an absolute, it was actually, I mean, it can't have been much fun for the 170 odd people in Scarborough who were killed, and probably not much fun for the 500 odd people who lost their houses. But in terms of the overall picture, it isn't a big one and they're never going to do it again. But it was a scandal that they got so close, it was a scandal that they weren't properly defended, and you can see how the Daily Mail is going to treat the whole thing, that the Germans have actually reached, penetrated, attacked, bombarded our coast, the cheek of it. Anyway, by the end of 1914, on the surface of the oceans, Britannia is ruling again. The Germans are staying at home in port. We are mining their waters so that they can't get out, or not easily, and actually patrolling. So Britannia is ruling the waves by the beginning of 1915. Except that under the waves they are developing something new and different. Right? Well, there's a lot of photos on the Western Front. You've seen it all before. With the kids, this is the point where I stop, give them an exercise book, draw yourself a trench, how are you going to arm it, and you start banging in periscopes to look and all the rest of it. Anyway, one or two pictures for you, just because this is our image. And when we look at other countries, their image of a war is probably fairly different. But this is what we think of when we think of the First World War. On the left, the trenches. This terrible new weapon, gas, bottom one, that is a gas attack. Top one, the effects of the gas attack. All countries have, for what it's worth, already subscribed to a ban on gas and chemical weapons. And it's not fair to say that one tore it up faster than the other, really. It's a good lesson learned that the wind can carry the gas back, which was one of the reasons it wasn't used more often. More of that. More of that. Big weapons on the left. Next 5 years are how do we get out of this stalemate? Various different attempts to do so. One of the on the left, that is a mine. Those of you who've read Birdsong, I think until I read Birdsong, I had not reckoned with the fact that miners, people from not far from here, if they went into the troops, their skills were to be used by mining underground, and you dig a whole mine towards the enemy, so that you can explode underneath them. The most effective time it happened was in the Battle of the Messines Ridge, which is attached part of the side part of the Third Battle of Ypres, which we come to. But then 10,000 Germans lost their lives to a mine there. And don't ask how many of the miners lost their lives on the way to blowing it up, but that was an effective underground mining type explosion. Right, this is really just to sum that lot up. By the time we reach the beginning of 1915, it is clear that we are now dug in on something that we don't know how to get out of it. And one of the impacts of war is that by now, already, a lot of people have died. So to do anything about ending it is to say that they died in vain. You are now committed. Do you remember sort of seeing this and thinking this in every war you've ever sort of witnessed from afar? Be it Vietnam, be it Afghanistan, whatever. People have died. We can't get out without saying that they died for nothing. Another of the new aspects of war, initially, one of the extraordinary things is that flight is less than 10 years old. Flying machines have only been going for less than 10 years. One of the pluses, I'm not sure if you're aware, but in the course of all this stuff that's come out in celebration of the First World War, there's a book has been published which says that war is beneficial. One of the attitudes behind this great we're going to war is that war is what young men should be doing. Young men need to get it out of this sort of stuff, which is so foreign to us but was not so foreign to them then. Well, one of the pluses, genuine pluses or advances, I was in Spain last week. I flew to Spain. The reason I flew to Spain is that those aircraft, those flying machines, took off so rapidly. The advances that followed, an enormous number of those advances, are due to what we're talking about here. The state of the aircraft industry, the state of flying, could have been a very different story if it wasn't for this. It had been jogging along as a gentleman's sport until this happened. Now you've got the big brains and the big money getting behind it. What's the aim of it at first? The big aim is actually to see what the enemy are up to. So you fly over the top. But then, while you're flying over the top, they're finding ways of attacking you. So you have to learn how to attack them, and it becomes. So you move from recces to dogfights. And the Royal Flying Corps, which was on the bottom right, is trenchard. And the progress of flying, the progress in the actual flying machines, as well as the combat, has to be one of the achievements. This is a bit that we don't know too much about. I mean, basically, far more people died there in the end, the number of Russians. And just remember, in terms of getting a perspective on it, we think so much about the trenches. The Germans are involved on two fronts. This one, more of them are actually involved in this one. More of them are going to die in this one. More Russians are going to die in that than the British and the French. Almost combined. So this is going on all the time. It starts well for the Germans. But then the Battle of Tannenberg and Masurian Lakes, organised by a chap up there called Hindenburg, who you may remember is the guy who appointed Hitler, and was then ousted, well, died, but anyway. President, a hero of the First World, and he was a hero. His achievements in the Eastern Front were quite considerable. Right? I said that we are supreme above the water. They are developing faster than we are, these things. And this is becoming serious. The picture at the bottom is our liner full of Americans sent to the bottom of the sea by U-boats, torpedoed in other words, and a big propaganda coup for us in the American eyes. Right, we're stuck on the Western Front. How are we going to get out of it? Well, this is a possible distraction. If you is that me? If we take it that we really don't know what to do.
It's your switch. It's the switch. So the one in your hand.
Yes.
Yes.
No, this is that. Oh, that's doing that, is it? Sorry. This is doing that. I'll try not to do that. We're looking for ways to break a stalemate. One way to break a stalemate is to do some fighting somewhere else. If we take that top left picture, to the left is the Mediterranean, to the top right is the Black Sea. So that's Constantinople, and the gap in the middle is a thing called the Sea of Marmara, ever so tiny. Well, we start off by attempting, the aim here is to get Turkey out of the war and to link up with the Russians so that we can help the Russians. And in other words, we can get involved on the Eastern Front. Anyway, the trouble with all these distractions, or one of the troubles with all these distractions, is a reluctance to take people away, because of course if the Western Front had collapsed, then whatever's going on anywhere else, the story is all over. So we were reluctant. One of the naval episode is called the Dardanelles, and that's the Straits of the Dardanelles. When that fails, with the sinking of more ships and being so far away that we haven't really got proper control on it, we have another variation on it. The Australians and New Zealanders have arrived in, not quite Europe, they're exercising in Egypt. The question is, how and when? What are we going to do with them? How do we get them over to here, or to the Western Front? And the answer is, let's use them for this distraction. So, having failed with the naval bit, we're going to have the landings, the Gallipoli landings, and huge heroism, in horrible fighting, water, red seawater, red with blood, as they try and land in the face of Turkish machine guns Turkey, which has been a bit of a joke, actually getting its own back and ceasing to be a bit of a joke. The rest of it, you know, I think. I mean, basically, the Dardanelles and Gallipoli campaigns are seen to have been failures. The guy who's blamed for them is the bottom left. A man called Winston Churchill, some of you've heard of. First Lord of the Admiralty at the beginning of this war, he's helped to build up the Navy. He thought this was a good idea. He backed it. He didn't get sufficient resources. It wasn't sufficiently well organised. Of course, it's a long way away as well. Anyway, it went wrong. Australians and New Zealanders have never forgiven him. It is, on the whole, a disaster. I was going to read this bit. The Battle of Jutland. One of the things that's changed in our lifetime is that this overall perspective that the First World War was not worth fighting, or what was it about, what did it achieve, was something that you daren't ask. It was something I never dared ask my father. My father lost his father in this, and it was something you kind of didn't discuss. And the name Jutland, for that generation, the generation above ours, is a glory. You know, the Battle of Jutland, Great Britain. In fact, the Battle of Jutland, kind of nobody won. Both sides claimed victory. The British lost more ships and twice as many sailors. In fact, we lost 6,784 and they lost 3,339, according to whatever I got this from. We lost twice as many ships, it lost twice as many sailors and a lot more ships, and the British press criticised the Grand Fleet's failure to force a decisive outcome. Equally, Scheer's plan of destroying a substantial portion of the British fleet also failed. The Germans' fleet in being continued to pose a threat, requiring the British to keep their... So we went back to where we were before. The Germans went back into port. We had to stay on patrolling to make sure they didn't come out of port. They didn't come out of port. They never came out of port again until the very end. So the battle confirmed the German policy of avoiding all-out fleet, all-out one against one. At the end of the year, a further unsuccessful attempt to reduce the Royal Naval's numerical advantage, the German Navy turned its efforts and resources to unrestricted submarine warfare. Knowing that they're not coming out, and knowing that they can't come out and can't take us on any other way, they turned even more attention to the U-boats, and that became the focus of their naval efforts. And the focus of their naval efforts are very serious for us as time goes on. Right, that has taken us through 1915 stalemate. We now hit 1916. This is where it's all going to come to an end. Well, the Germans' big effort, very big effort, was against the French in that fortified area which they were avoiding when they went through Belgium. And this is the biggest fort, the most famous fort. On the left, a man called Falkenhayn. His famous quote is, "Bleed the French white." One of the features of this war in the end is that both sides are beginning to calculate that we will win because we've got more men. In the end, the Germans recognise that by the time the Americans have come in, we really have got more men, and basically we can last out longer than they can. It's very uncomfortable, just this sort of, if they all get shot, we'll have 5 left. So anyway, Falkenhayn's famous quote, "Bleed the French white." His famous quote, you know who he is? That's Pétain, the hero of the Second World War, or maybe not. He's the hero of Verdun. His famous quote is, "They shall not pass. They are not coming through." And the French renewed and refortified and restocked, remanned that fort endlessly throughout the summer of 1916. The people who were in there at the beginning really were all killed, but they were topped up and topped up and topped up. And how did they get topped up? They got topped up along a single road, the Via Sacra, which, anyway, pretty grim stuff. And the pressure that they're under affects this one. Oh, sorry, that's still that. That's still Verdun. I'd forgotten I got this. There we are. The horrors of Verdun. That's the landscape of it. This was due to have been in August 1916, but because of the pressure on the French, we brought it forward. This is the huge, over-the-top effort that is going to end it all. We've had a year of stalemate, a year of not knowing how to do it. Well, how are we going to do it? We're going to bombard them harder and faster than ever before, and we did so. And you will go over the top tomorrow. And you will be driving towards empty trenches because we've blasted them out of a way altogether. And it's not true, and Blackadder went over the top. Anyway, on the first day, 60,000 casualties. That is 3 times, I'd like to drop this in because figures don't mean much, 3 times the population of Porthcawl casualties on one day. By the end of this campaign, it drifts on until November with virtually no gain at all, and 1 million casualties on the extended Battle of the Somme. That's also a sort of an extension of the stuff on the Somme. The little church is Albert, a village in the Somme region, and the angel at the top of the steeple of Albert stayed at that angle for months, well, for the rest of the war, I believe. It became a sort of a symbol. It became almost a superstition. If that angel had actually dropped, it would have been taken like the ravens leaving the tower or something like that. Back at home, as we reach the end of you've got 3 big battles in 1916. None of them has really, despite the huge casualty rate of all of them. That was Jutland, and on land, in terms of casualty rate, way, way more. Verdun and the Somme. On the left, Asquith's time as Prime Minister has come to an end. Somebody from that little principality is about to become Prime Minister. Winning. This is meant to be a little reflection on the home front. Incidentally, at the time when Churchill was ditched after the Dardanelles stuff, we went into coalition government. As we went into coalition government, we got half Conservatives, half Liberal. By the time this has taken place, the Liberals are divided, so that the majority in Lloyd George's coalition government, the majority is actually going to be Conservative. So that's going to affect things for the future. And at the bottom, it is as a result of this is just reflecting on the home front, rationing was introduced at the end of 1917, and the rationing on eggs, butter and sugar, I think it was, 3 big. The rationing lasted through to 1920. So those of us like me who didn't actually survive much of the Second War, but did know that little bit of rationing which lasted into the 50s. Same thing happened in the First War. The rationing of some of the big... And one of the other things, just in terms of impact on people's lives, is that this is when this breakdown of a class system, or at least reduction in class... They came, in the course of introducing rationing, they come to understand how the people in charge come to understand a little bit better how the poor live, the quality of nutrition for the poor. It's more true of the Second World War rationing, when the ruling classes came to understand that in Second World War rationing, the poorest of the poor actually did better out of rationing than they had been living before, because they were told things were provided that hadn't been part of their diet before. Anyway, that's a little bit on the home front. we're into 1917, and there's a huge turnaround. First turnaround is that on top right, Nicholas abdicates and the Russians start to change. We have a republic, a parliamentary government in Russia struggling to get its mistake with hindsight was that it carried on fighting the war. And in its continuing with the war, you have, and it makes us vulnerable to the fact that the troops are not only seeing better standards of living than they're used to and miles away from home, they're worried about what's happening at home and want to get back home to make sure that they get a share of whatever's going on. And that affects things. One of the Germans' cleverer tricks is the bottom left. In Switzerland, there's a Russian exile by name of Lenin, or Vladimir Ulyanov. He's in Switzerland, and the Germans smuggle him literally through Finland back to Germany, where he is going to start the October Revolution. On top left, in April, Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States since 1913, was re-elected in 1916 as the man who kept them out of a war. He is re-inaugurated, he has his renewal ceremony in March 1916, it's a month or two later than it would be now, and in April 1916 the Americans join in the war. The U-boat campaign is making an impact, everything is, and in that he is saying, to make the world safe for democracy. That's his quote. That's their American reason for joining in. From April 1916, the tables have turned. The picture has changed. From the German point of view, it's even more desperate. If we don't get something done now, the Yanks are coming. In 1917, things don't go particularly well. The French army, under this man Nivelle, starts to rebel. We have mutineers. What do you do to mutineers? What do you do to... So there we have that top left. The Germans move their line. They move to the Hindenburg line, especially being built. Our reconnaissance must have known that it was happening, but anyway, they moved to a new, freshly built, modern, well-fortified, the whole thing. So that was one of their big steps. And Vimy Ridge is just one of the many horrible battles. That's the most famous one of... It's the third battle of Ypres. To understand what Ypres is about, there is a little point in the line. So you've got your line, the line of trenches is there, then you have a little bit, and it's called a salient. When you hear about salients, a salient is a bulge in the line. And if you have a bulge in the line, then you can attack it from sideways as well. And this is 3 times. This is the third Battle of Ypres. The first one was right back at the beginning. There was one in 1915. This time, even bigger than the Somme. This time, the explosives that are poured upon this area in 1917 are such that you can hear the explosions on the cliffs of Dover. It is absolutely huge. And it is effective. It does break the line. But in breaking the line, it also breaks the water barriers and causes bottom left or left-hand side, well, all of it. This is, in shorthand, the Battle of the Mud. Quite a lot of people died, nothing to do with enemy fire, but to do with getting stuck in the mud. And if you're stuck in the mud and people are firing at you, and you're ducking and diving, the only way forward, the bottom left actually illustrates it, the only way forward was actually to move onto that duckboard and wait for somebody to pass you one from behind, drop it into place, and really that was progress at stages in this terrible battle. The Battle of Passchendaele, the Battle of the Mud, third Battle of Ypres. More pictures of the same. The thing on the left is pretty clear. Some of them are knee-deep. Horses, out of date now, horses could get buried in that mud. Meanwhile, something else is happening. Turkey, we're having another go in the Middle East. Allenby is in the centre. On the left is Peter Lawrence of Arabia. Very significant. This is actually where my grandfather died out here, and was buried in Egypt. Bottom right, Allenby is moving into Jerusalem. Now that, as a landmark in history, is hugely... This is the first time since the Crusades that Christians have taken that area. The Turks are in retreat. The Turks are beaten. We are, and of course, in the next couple of years, we're going to spend a lot of time redrawing the map of the Middle East and drawing it so successfully that it's an area of peace ever since. I'm not pretending that it's easy, but the way that we thought we could draw maps and sort out problems and rule the world has got quite a lot to answer for ever since, really. What do I want to say about other? The other little bits. Top left is actually about a rather almost forgotten area of ethnic cleansing when the Turks eliminated most of the population of Armenia. The top right is the Czech Legion. Well, just to remind us, there is no such country as Czechoslovakia at that time, but this is a legion of soldiers who, from the Austrian Empire, actually get themselves involved almost on the other side. And the most famous contribution for Czech Legion is actually after the Russian Revolution, when they're helping the whites. Bottom one is just to remind us that there was a Japanese flag on one of those earlier pictures. And the Japanese did control the Pacific for us and made sure that the German Navy didn't do anything naughty down there. And while they're doing it, they have freedom to operate. And if you can read Chinese, I believe that the thing on the right actually is an agreement that the Japanese should have a free hand in China while they're at it, which is the beginning of problems to come. In the meantime, yet again, if you were an Italian and thinking about the First World War, you'd not be thinking about the Western Front. Your first image would not be our lot in the trenches. Your first image would be their lot in the Alps. Italy, I said at the very beginning, Italy was actually contracted to Germans and Austrians before the war. In 1915, they joined in on our side because their real enemy was Austria. Italy is a new country, just to remind you. Italy in 1860 was not a country. Italy in 1815, Italy in 1830 was lots of little states. Some of them ruled by people far away. Some of them ruled by Austrian princes and things. By 1860, 1865, 1870 definitely, you can say that Italy exists. But it's a new country. And its biggest old enemy, the one that needed sorting out before it could unite, was Austria. So the idea that it was in an alliance with Austria doesn't quite work. And if they've got ambitions, it is to take a little bit more of the territory. We've actually been to the Italian bit of the Tyrol, where it's German speaking, but it belongs to Italy as a result of this. So anyway, Italy joined in. The fighting there, the fighting in the Alps, lots of names, battles that we don't really know too much about. But as I say, if you were Italian, you would be more conscious of them than you would about the Somme and Verdun. Tanks and Yanks, it's corny really, but one of the things that is being developed is this metal machine. A metal machine which has been disguised in cardboard boxes, labelled tanks so the Germans might think that it was water supplies as it's taken over there. And it has a lot of failures, but it also begins to have successes. By 1917, it is having some successes. By 1918, it's going to be a key part of the final campaigns. and the Americans are beginning to arrive by the autumn of 1917. Top right is Pershing, the man in charge of them. In 1918, in March 1918, the Germans finally won the war. They got the breakthrough that both sides have been looking for 4 years. They broke through on the Western Front. But, sorry, bottom left is Ludendorff. Can't quite remember, there must be obviously a connection between that picture and their breakthrough. But their breakthrough is, yet again, to give us one of these bulges in the line. And although they've got through, it isn't clear. They've been waiting so long for this excitement of breaking through, they don't quite know what to do. And it isn't properly coordinated. So while they're not knowing what to do, we are able to cut them off and bring it to an end. But anyway, it's what both sides have been, and all those lives have been aiming to do precisely that. And when it happened, it didn't reach the conclusion that it had been wanted, that had been hoped for. Our response is way overdue. If you want to criticise the generals, if you want to criticise the politicians, we have not coordinated with our allies as well as we should. That 100 years or that 1,000 years of being enemies with the French, we don't trust them. They don't trust us. There have been so many little areas of difference. Now, finally, with the Americans coming in, somebody has got to take charge. And the somebody who took charge is Marshal Foch up there. And it's coordinated command at last. And this 100 days in the summer of 1918 is, we will punch them here today and we will punch them there tomorrow. And while they're wondering whether we're going there or there, we'll go there on Tuesday. And that is, in fact, what happened. It's coordinated, continuous, boom, 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 instead of bang or bang, boom. And this is how we finally won the war. So that's the beginning of the end. On the way to the armistice, we have had the breakdown of so many things. The top right picture is food riots in Berlin. The German Navy has mutinied at the end of October. The Kaiser himself abdicated. He abdicated the Kaisership and hoped at first to continue to be King of Prussia. But it was a pipe dream, it wasn't going to work. But so anyway, things are falling apart. Austria has fallen apart. Turkey has actually withdrawn at the end of October. So it's all over. And that is the railway train at Compiègne, which will be important again. We'll see another little bit of history in May 1940 when the Germans used the same train for their revenge. Right, bottom picture, bottom right, is the big three at Versailles. The big three, Lloyd George, Clemenceau and Woodrow Wilson. And the fourth, you can count, the fourth member of the big three is Orlando of Italy. Right, great art from this war, all of it designed to show how horrible it was. Great poetry, which only became fashionable in our adulthood, was unsuitable for my dad who lost his dad. All this, how horrible, how awful, how unnecessary, how cruel it was unacceptable until our grown-up years. At about the time when I'm starting teaching this thing, it is now acceptable to say how awful, how avoidable it must have been, although it is amazingly difficult to know quite how it would be avoided, but how, the numbers and everything, the horror of it. Right, quick run through again. That's the peace treaty, the same big three with lots of others thrown in. The British point of view, it was horrible. We won. The Empire's point of view, we backed them. It was horrible. Together we won. The French point of view, we got them. They got us 50 years ago. We've done it. We are going to punish them. And that's the thinking behind it. The next flag was the old Russian flag, which has been taken over by a flag you may recognise, the hammer and sickle. The Belgian point of view, I've given it to you. The Japanese point of view, well, they did very nicely out of the whole show. Back up to Serbia. One of the things I didn't give you. Serbia had a very rough time in 1914. Serbia collapsed in 1915. Serbia was invaded. One of the reasons that, bottom right, Bulgaria joined in was to join in the beating up of Serbia. Bulgaria as a country, I think I have done this actually, have I? Did I say it before? Bulgaria was invented in 1870s. It fought several wars. Anyway, this is its golden moment. This is the time when Bulgaria can come into its own and grab. Unfortunately, it backed the losing side. Going back to my initial pattern, Serbia, the fighting goes on. There's a little bit of fighting I didn't mention at Salonika. Salonika is our effort, always too little and always too late, to back the Serbs and we weren't helped by the Greeks, because the Greek Prime Minister was on our side, but the Greek King was sympathetic to the Germans, which made life a bit confusing, which meant that any operations around there, in the end, they do nominally join in on ours. But anyway, it didn't happen very well. I'm now looking at, I've done Serbia, Italy. Well, Italy has made huge sacrifices, but it's on the winning side. It's going to get its little bit of the Austrian Empire that it wants as a reward. Romania, at least it's on the right side. It's lost an enormous number of men. We come to that. Germany, black, white and red has given way to black, yellow and red. It is now about to become a republic. It's going to have a very rough time as a republic until it is handed over to a man with a moustache, a different moustache. Austro-Hungary is broken up and finished forever. It is now, with Woodrow Wilson, behind the idea of self-determination. Each race or ethnic group can have its own country as much as possible. Well, the place where it's most put into practice is that you can invent Yugoslavia. You can invent Czechoslovakia. You can try and do the right thing you can do the right thing at least by Romania and Italy, because they were on the right side. The Ottoman Empire is now at an end. We will hand out the bits and pieces of that to the winners. So Britain can take the mandate for Palestine, which we now call Israel, can take the mandate for Jordan, can take the mandate for Iraq. France can have Syria and Lebanon. And we'll hand it all out. Am I done there? Yes. Top left is the Verdun one. Bottom left is Menin Gates, thank you. Middle is some of you know better than I do, and I've no idea when one on the top right is. Right. There you go. $5.9 million from famine and disease. I don't know if that includes the flu epidemic of 1918-19 or not. There were a couple of little statistics that I wanted to do from here. Oh yes, well, part of it's there. Serbia, that is 28% of their population. more than a quarter of the population of Serbia died. And I've got a worse one. The worst one is Bulgaria. I told you that Bulgaria joined in order to cash in on the vulnerability of Serbia and do a bit of grabbing. It's in particular, it wants to spread into Macedonia and around there. They had some success. They did quite well against the Russians. At the end, they lost 87,000 people, which was 1/3 of their population. 1/3 of their population. And then if you just look at the other statistics, I haven't found a way of telling you what else we could have done, but it is a pretty horrible story. It's 100 years ago. There are ways in which I don't believe we can any longer understand it. Somebody said to me this morning, literally I was saying I was going to do this talk, and somebody said, oh, life was cheap. Well, life may have been cheap, and sending people. And there's a book out now which tells you that the statistics of the Napoleonic Wars, the statistics of some of those earlier wars are nearly as bad. And at the time when this is being fought, it's maybe being seen in the same way. One of the myths that goes along with the idea that it's lions led by donkeys, which on the whole I think is fairly unfair. There was a great deal of incompetence, there were a great many mistakes, there's a great lack of imagination as to how to get out of it. But it is easier to say that than it is to put yourself in the situation at the time and actually get out of it. And the other thing that changed is actually that the officer class, the gentleman class, casualties are very nearly. It is unlikely that a general was going to get killed, since a few did. But the officer class, the public school memorial boards are every bit as bad as the state school. It was all in it together. So I think that may be it. Thank you.
Andrew, thank you very much. Now, there were two incidents in my life which made me realise what a horrific, dirty, horrible war the First World War, and was meant, of course, to be the war to end wars. My father fought there, fought in the trenches, never spoke about it to us as children. But after his death, one of his brothers, an uncle of mine, showed us some letters that he had written during that war. And that's when I realised what a terrible war it was. Then there was the other incident, when we sat around the radio as a family on that Sunday morning when Chamberlain declared war on Germany. And my father, who was a hero, broke down and cried, realising what this meant. So I'm sure there are numbers here who had similar experiences. I now invite you to put questions to Andrew or to make comments.
I think it would be a good idea if all women read America. Because all men,
Nita has just suggested that countries should be ruled and governed by women.
the men ought to look after the children.
Anyone else? You've done it against Andrew. Yes.
What was the strategic significance of Ypres, and why did we expose ourselves to the salient?
I've always assumed that the salient was dictated by the landscape. Am I wrong? I don't know. I don't know otherwise. I mean, it was obviously a vulnerable point in this line of trenches, because 3 times it is fought over. Yes, I need to actually you need a relief map to see whether my answer is right or not. I don't know.
Yes?
It's always said that the seeds of the Second World War were sown at the end of the First World War because of Clemenceau and his reparations. Could then anything have been done differently which possibly would have prevented the Second World War?
I would have thought the answer to that was yes. The whole attitude of punishing the enemy. We over-punish the enemy, I think. We certainly, there's a group of people in Germany who do not accept the defeat, who thought they were betrayed. And one of them became rather... But we fed that. And then in terms of learning lessons, the build-up of that build-up, the build-up of dreadnoughts, the build-up of arms, the arms race, and so on. We learned from that we weren't going to do it again, so we weren't ready. So come 1930, when you talk about appeasement, the arguments for appeasement are pretty weak, but the strongest of them is that actually we weren't ready to fight. To have taken them on at the time of the Munich Agreement was probably to invite defeat. We weren't ready, and they were making ready.
Jeff?
I think the answer, to a certain extent, is the Treaty of Versailles after the war. Wilson was very much in favour of giving the Germans as much help as they possibly could. I think the main ones against the Germans were the French, who were frightened stiff of them, didn't want to see them rise again, and wanted to put them down and away. And they, with their treatment of the Germans, which eventually they won the argument, Wilson retired out of it in disgust, although Congress did as well. So the French have only got themselves to blame for the Second World War. When you sat around and listened to that radio, the French probably had as much to do with it as anybody else, because they never gave the Germans a chance, and you can't keep the Germans down.
I know that.
Anyone else?
Yes, on that is exactly the way the question was put, was that Clemenceau was the one for revenge. Lloyd George has actually called an election on the building a land fit for heroes, and hang the Kaiser was a slogan he didn't deny at the time.
And he failed us both.
Yeah. Tony.
You mentioned the Germans coming in on the first slides, coming in through the top, through Belgium into France. Where does the Netherlands, Holland fit into that? They were in that area, as it were.
The Schlieffen Plan route manages to avoid going upsetting the Netherlands.
So where did the Netherlands stand in the First World War?
The Netherlands was...
Just sat on the side, and on their doorstep, all this was happening?
I think so. I think the Netherlands was nominally neutral.
We had prisoner of war camps in the Netherlands.
They had prisoner of war camps, right. People from Porthcawl were in the Netherlands, were they?
No,
Right.
it's just...
Right. We've got a far more expert one with the Porthcawl angle coming up in a few months' time.
Yeah, just fine. Thanks for that marvellous balanced presentation on the way you put it across, Andrew. Can I just try and understand, I mean, just before this, there had been the great religious revolution, in many ways, the revitalization in the 1904, 1910. And so presumably we were, as a country, very conscious of defending the great beliefs of liberty and freedom. Way away in Sarajevo, this event took place, but Belgium was now threatened. You've given us the factual situation. But if you had to express a personal opinion from all the research you've done, could we in fact have done anything other than go in at that time?
I think that is actually a question which 3 months ago I would probably have said, yes, we shouldn't have done it. And now I am far less clear from some of the stuff that's been on telly, the way, I mean, I saw the Edith Cavell bit as being propaganda, but the Kaiser's arrogant march through Belgium. That Belgian bit tips the scales quite a bit. Whether we actually needed to, we could have declared war without going over there and getting that. So I just don't know. But I mean, Ferguson is taking one line, and Max Hastings has taken another, and people more expert than I am can't answer that question. So I'm not too ashamed of not knowing.
I'll take one more question or comment. None.
That was just about.
Can I make a comment, Sandal?
Yeah.
I apologise because I know that some of you will have heard me say this before. Last July, Dorothy and I and one of my sisters went out to the area of the Battle of the Somme, and we saw one of the monuments, the Thiepval monument, that was built by Lichens and commemorates 50,000 people who were killed on the Somme and whose bodies were never found. And my grandfather was one of those. And we went out there and we saw this monument in the middle of this huge parkland. There was no noise, no traffic noise or anything there. And I'd read 2 books just before that about the turmoil, the terrible suffering in that battle. And you stood on the steps of that monument and you looked out over the countryside and you could think 100 years ago, nearly 100 years ago, about the huge suffering, the huge noise, the turmoil, as I say, that took place in that countryside, which was now all restored, and now all silent. Silent except, honestly, for the song of the birds. And I have never felt more inadequate in being able to express an emotion than at that moment. And I think that was one of the most moving moments of my experience. And I just wanted to take this opportunity just to say that. And thank you for giving me the chance to do it.
Thank you, Derek. I did say that there were people out here today who have some experience like that. I've explained, I have my own experience. Now then, let me tell you that there's coffee waiting. I'd be pleased to join you for coffee. Let's have a chat over this talk and future talk. And could I remind the conveners and assistant conveners who are present, could I remind you of the meeting on Friday when we gather together, committee and conveners, to look to our future. Now, before we, where's it gone? Well, I'd like to say on your behalf now, I'd like to express our thanks to Andrew for once again turning up with an excellent presentation.